Yeah. Yeah. And of course, who's also a lot of people like that. He was one of the boys. Did he have a good Yiddish or not? I suspect he did. He had German. I suspect they brought him in because he no, they certainly would. Signal you when we're ready. Do you want Common to just signal you when we're ready? Do you want Common to just signal to you when we're ready? I have this, but I don't need it. He's asking. Exactly. Whenever I'm ready. All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to start. So I'm going to read my prepared remarks as I see that as I age, my vision is getting worse and worse. So I should have made the font a bit bigger. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Common Weiser. I'm the Silber Family Professor of Modern Jewish Studies here at York University, and I will be returning from sabbatical in the fall to serve again as director of York University's Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, What We Don't Know About Canadian Jewish Life. Tonight's event is part of a larger series of Canadian Jewish programs that have made the Koshitsky Center one of the preeminent hosts and curators of programming about Jewish life, letters, and sounds, specifically in Canada. These events include not only concerts, academic symposia and lectures, book launches and interviews with authors, but also the annual Canadian Jewish Literary Awards, the CJN's Young Writers Contests, and the Canadian Jewish Literary Fiction Panel. Now, a tremendous amount of preparation went into the making of tonight's event, and there are many parties to thank. I'd like to start by thanking our co-sponsors, the UJA Federation of Greater Toronto's Koshitsky Center for Jewish Education, and the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. I'd of course also like to thank tonight's panel of distinguished speakers who will be joining us, who are sitting behind me. Finally, I would like to express my profound gratitude to two people in particular. Tonight's event is really the brainchild of my colleague, Professor David Koffman, York's J. Richard Schiff Chair in Canadian Jewish Studies. It is part of his outstanding work to develop the field of Canadian Jewish studies, not only as one deserving the attention and admiration of scholars in diverse fields inside and outside of Canada, but also as a tool for Canadian Jewry to understand its past and to contemplate its future. David has done a stellar job stewarding the Koszyczki Center during my absence this year. As reflected in the high volume of academic and cultural events we have hosted in the last 12 months, the center is more active than ever. None of this would have been possible, however, without the wisdom, guidance, and quite simply, the hard work of our center's coordinator extraordinaire, Julie Feinberg. Thank you, David and Julie, as well as thank you to all of my Koszyczki Center colleagues who make the center so vibrant. Now, before commencing tonight's event, it's important that we recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, at this point, I would like to say a word about tonight's first two speakers. Professor J.J. McMurtry, Dean of York's Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, and Professor Rhonda Lenton, President of York University. You are perhaps already aware that both are distinguished social scientists. Indeed, Professor Lenton is herself a researcher of Canadian Jewry and the co-author of several recent studies about its contemporary state based on the latest demographic research. What you perhaps do not know is that Dean McMurtry and President Lenton have been instrumental in helping Jewish studies at York to grow and become stronger. Among many other things, they have helped us realize our long-standing goal of creating a new position in pre-modern Jewish studies to help shore up an essential area in which we have lost faculty in recent years due to retirement and emigration. That position is held by our new colleague, Professor Mark Herman, who is here tonight, who is an expert in medieval Jewry and classic Jewish texts. They have also helped Professor Ahuva Shulman to expand our Hebrew language offerings and to make them available to an ever broader public inside and outside of York University. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Dean McMurtry to extend his welcome to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Coleman, and good evening to everybody, and hello to everybody online. It's always a bit odd to be looking into cameras and knowing there's people out there, but welcome here. So I'm so delighted to be here at this event and to see people again. Some of you I haven't seen in a very long time, and to meet new people tonight. It's really a great pleasure for me. So as Dean of the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, I am so proud that my faculty, as has been mentioned, is the home to Jewish studies. And it's really a proud home. We are so grateful that this program's here. And as you're saying, we see a huge future for this program going into the future. Jewish studies courses, I just found out, have been offered at York University for 55 years, which makes them slightly older than me. I won't say how much, but it's just an amazing legacy for the university and for the faculty to be offering these courses. Today, our faculty continue to deliver fascinating courses to Jewish and non-Jewish students across diverse campuses and experiences. They publish robust research that is of interest to both academic and public audiences, as was mentioned here. And I think they host a vibrant calendar of events for people to attend in the community, both at York University and the community more broadly. Liberal Arts and Professional Studies enjoys a strong connection with the interdisciplinary Israel and Golda Koszyczki Center for Jewish Studies, which connects our liberal arts professors with their Jewish studies colleagues in other disciplines, including fine arts, law, education, and others. It's really a robust ecosystem of study here. And as has been mentioned, we just are welcoming Professor Mark Herman, which is a really big, exciting moment for the faculty. And he's a specialist in pre-modern Jewish studies. This hire has enabled us to strengthen the area that needs further investment in the wake of some faculty retirements, as Coleman has already mentioned. And it's been a long-standing thing. I'm looking at Carl in the back there. I think I started as dean and you were already putting in my ear that this was an important investment to make, and I'm so glad that we've made it. And we're also looking forward to continue to grow the Jewish Studies program here. LAPS and the Koshitsky Center are now seeking to partner with the community on the creation of another exciting new hire, this one hopefully in contemporary Jewish studies. I sincerely believe that tonight we'll be talking about the importance of this, but the study of contemporary Jewish life in Canada is an area of need, serious investment, as our distinguished panel will no doubt articulate in greater depth. York's Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies and the Koshitsky Center share the ambition of keeping York University at the center of national public, community, and academic conversations on these topics. So again, I thank you all, both digital or remote and in-person folks, for attending this evening. And without further ado, I'd like to invite our president, Rhonda Lenton, to share some remarks in advance of the panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, JJ. Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir, bonjour. So whether you're joining us here in person or online, I really want to thank you for being with us tonight to share in this discussion on very important conversation, what we don't know about Canadian Jewish life. Canada's Jewish population, as I'm sure you all know, is the 4th largest in the world, but it's also one of the least researched, especially when compared to the United States or the UK. However, research on the Jewish community in Canada is needed more than ever, which is one of the topics that we will be exploring this evening. Society and the Jewish world in particular are undergoing huge changes. Concerns about anti-Semitism are on the rise once again, potentially exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, isolation, tensions in the Middle East, other factors. Again, what we don't know about some of these topics is outstanding. According to a Government of Canada fact sheet on anti-Semitism in Canada, 296 out of 608 hate crimes targeting religion that occurred as of May 2021 were towards the Jewish population. Given the times that we are in, it is particularly important to understand how the Jewish population in Canada is responding, is experiencing, what their experiences are. A 2013 study of American Jews by the Pew Research Center raised questions for Bob. Most of you know, I know this guy over here on the far side. For those of you who don't know, I'm married to him. Sorry, got slightly distracted there. Yeah, I know. It raised questions for Bob and me when we were talking about behave yourself. It raised questions for Bob and me when we were talking about the Pew research, about to what extent the findings in Pew, to what extent did they actually characterize the experiences of Jews in Canada. We're both sociologists, and as sociologists, I was particularly disappointed to find that actually there was quite sparse research that was done demographically on Jews in Canada, especially compared to the work that's been done in the United States. All of these factors led us to undertake an historic study of Canadian Jews in 2018. Can't believe that many years ago already. The first of its kind, born out of a collaboration between Robert Brym from the University of Toronto, myself, and Keith Newman from Environics Institute for Survey Research. For those of you who aren't aware of the study, it surveyed 2,335 Jews in Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg, and Vancouver, cities that actually hold 82% of Canada's Jewish population. We explored patterns of Jewish practice, upbringing, intermarriage, perceptions, experiences of anti-Semitism, connections to Israel, and personal and organizational connections. In many ways, the results surprised us. Our research showed that while a majority, 95% of respondents consider themselves Jewish, religion was not an area of main importance to their lives. Only 1/3 of Jews now actually reported that religion was a very important part of their Jewish identity, with culture and ethnicity being other incredibly important components of how we self-identify as Jewish. The most important discovery is that we are doing an unusually good job of keeping the community cohesive. I'm proud that York is one of the most diverse universities in Canada. Our vision is to provide a broad demographic of students with access to a high quality, research intensive university that is committed to driving positive change. And that includes a steadfast commitment to Jewish studies in both our research and our academics. The Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, for example, as has been mentioned, was Canada's first interdisciplinary research center in Jewish studies, bringing together a community of scholars and teachers to promote research specifically. The center is engaged in the community, including supporting the annual Canadian Jewish Literary Awards, along with the Department of Music in our School of the Arts, Media, Performance and Design, launching Sound and Sense, Jewish Music at York, a year-long concert lecture series. This initiative was made possible thanks to funding from the Israeli Foundation. Hiring Mark Herman, where is Mark? Hi, Mark. Hiring Mark Herman as a tenure stream professor in pre-modern Jewish studies and beginning to raise funds for an endowed chair in contemporary Jewish studies are just other incredibly important examples of the significance that we place on Jewish studies and where we see the importance in terms of moving forward. And I really want to just pause for a second on this chair in contemporary Jewish studies, because based on the work that Bob and I did with Environics and the lack of research, what we realize is missing to some extent in the whole area, no matter which program you go to across which university, is a real focus on driving the kind of basic social science research that needs to be done to understand all these questions that we are asking about the experiences of Jews, about anti-Semitism, about intermarriage, Jewish identity, and so forth. So before I close, I just want to reiterate that more research is needed. We're interested in doing more research, but you need kind of a strong foundation to support that research. And my hope is that through events like this and through centers like the Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, that the study that Bob and I did and with Keith will just be the beginning of much more research in this area. And I believe that York University is the university to lead in this kind of research that needs to be done. So thank you so much. Merci miigwech. And I think it's my pleasure, I get to introduce David. It's my great pleasure to introduce David Koffman, who will be moderating tonight's panel. David, as has been said, is the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry in the Department of History at York University. He is an author of several publications, an acting director of the Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, and the editor-in-chief of the journal Canadian Jewish Studies. Please welcome David Koffman.
Thank you very much, President Lenton, for the lovely setup and introduction. And thank you, Dean McMurtry, both for the support that you've both thrown behind our Jewish Studies program and our Center for Jewish Studies. Our expansion and our thriving and our capacity just to do good for our students and our communities that we reach at York and beyond, Jewish and non-Jewish, owe an enormous debt of gratitude to your vision and your confidence in us. So really, thank you. If humanity has an essence at all, a single element that makes us us, to paraphrase the mid-20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger, it comes in the form of a question. To the extent that there's any unifying or defining aspect of the experience of being human, he said, this essence could be articulated not as a fact about us, but as something that ends with a question mark. Now, I love this idea. We scholars rightfully take pride in bringing the new knowledge that our research has generated into the world. It's an important and privilege and responsibility. And I, for one, think that what we scholars do is important to the communities we live in and to humanity. Sometimes it's true, we can come across as know-it-alls or experts. So fascinated we are in the new truths that we've uncovered. But in the secret heart of the scholar, there's a confession. All too well, we know only a small hint of what we don't know. As soon as we make a claim, we open up all sorts of other questions into what sometimes feels like an endless realm of unknowns. This can be humbling. It can also be very frustrating. Some of us have imposter syndrome our entire careers, knowing full well what we don't know. But this state of unknowing, what Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, my favorite contemporary Torah commentator, in her commentary on Parshas Bereshit at the very start of the Hebrew Bible, called the beginning of desire. From the void of not knowing, from absence and confusion, begins desire, the desire to know, to really get. And from that desire eventually grows knowing, and from there, perhaps, wisdom. The program that we bring tonight is about what we don't know about Canadian Jewish life. My hope for this evening is to generate and stimulate good questions, more questions, ones that we'll leave here tonight still hoping to answer. I know that our panelists will probably be tempted to spend time on answers, but I'm hoping we can linger a little bit in this precious space of not knowing. I proudly serve as the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry. As an historian, there are tons of questions that would take books to answer that I've been brainstorming over the years, research projects that have not been undertaken, subjects about which you can't read any scholarship on yet. There's a lot we don't know about this history. We have almost no scholarship about Jews and the founding of this nation, about Confederation. We have almost nothing on the history of Jews and business, including the important garment industry, on Jews in medicine, on the arts, on philanthropy, or even on the history of Jews and electoral politics in Canada, something basic. As of this year only, we have the first serious study of Jews during Quebec's Quiet Revolution, so you're only able to read that if you read French. There's very little to read if you want to understand how Jews thought about or affected or responded to the 1982 Constitution Act with its Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The last book written about Jews of Toronto was published 5 decades ago, and it only went up to 1937. There's no scholarship that an interested student of Canadian Jewish history could read on the demise of the Canadian Jewish Congress and the reconfiguration of Jewish advocacy or lobbying work, or really anything about our extraordinary federation system from the past 75 years when the one study ended. So there are many absences and many gaps, and my field as a historian is still very much wide open. But tonight we're generating questions not about history, but about the living contemporary community, and are wondering after the state and the future of both academic and applied research on Canadian Jews. That's why I've invited 4 of the world's leading social researchers, Dr. Daniel Held, Chief Program Officer at the UJA Federation of Greater Toronto, who earned his PhD here in Jewish Studies right here at York. Professor Morton Weinfeld, Chair in Canadian Ethnic Studies at McGill University, and Professors Bob Brym, the S.D. Clark Chair in Sociology at the University of Toronto, and Randal Schnoor, researcher and lecturer here at Toronto. The 2 of them, incidentally, have just published a landmark book of essays to which 26 different contributors, scholars contributed to, mostly focused on contemporary concerns. For those in our public audience today, you can pick up a copy if you'd like when we're done. The book is called Ever Dying People, ? Canadian Jews in Comparative Perspective, a must read if you're interested in tonight's subject matter. You can read up on the other panelists, truly incredible achievements and contributions online. We just have too little time for extensive bios tonight. But in the spirit, lastly, of generating questions, I'd like to take advantage of the fact that so many people have joined us online from coast to coast to coast, including fellow scholars and leaders of various Jewish communities across the country, to ask, as questions pop up in your minds, that you write them down using the Q&A function and send them in. We can use tonight as a kind of crowdsourcing occasion for questions that really need to be asked and in due time, hopefully answered. I'll write down these questions, kind of keep track of them after the panel. So we'll have a little bit of a question bank for future research, and you can feel free to email me down the line if you're interested in this list. Panel, let's start with your top 2 most pressing questions and your top 2 most fascinating questions, if they're different, that you'd like to see answered in, say, the next 3 years. Now, I'd like to also know if you see these questions as urgent because of your own intellectual interests, because of current issues in the scholarly worlds that you circulate in, because you think they'd actually really improve the fabric of Jewish communal life, or some combination of these. So what don't we know about Canadian Jewish life? We're going to start with Bob and work our way through the panel this way.
Thank you. I think the first thing we don't know is how to create a cohort of social scientists who can study Canadian Jewry. I have to confess that I failed, and so was Mort, except for Randy, because Randy was Mort's student. But it so happens that this generation of scholars that Mort and I represent is now either on the verge of retirement or has recently retired or stopped doing research some years ago. And now we're facing something of a crisis in the social scientific study of Canadian Jewry, because we're on the way out and we have only Randy left as this new cohort. So to me, that's something we don't know and we've actually failed at. And that's why I'm so encouraged to hear, I guess I should call you Professor or President Lenton in this context, say that there's an initiative to try to create a chair of social scientific study of Canadian Jews at York. I think it's critically important, and I'm delighted that you've taken that step. So do you want me to go on to the second point?
Please
Okay.
do.
Second point, I can be a little more substantive. When we did the 2018 survey of Canadian Jews, we learned that one of the chief concerns of the Canadian Jewish community has to do with anti-Semitism. No surprise. Remembrance of the Holocaust was the #1 issue that Canadian Jews feel is essential to being Jewish. But we know actually very little about anti-Semitism in Canada. We do know some things. We have, for example, I brought a slide with me. We have the B'nai B'rith study, an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. I put up here in this slide the number of anti-Semitic incidents per year from 1982 to 2022 per 100,000 Canadians. You don't need to be a social scientist to see that it's sloping upward. As a matter of fact, the rate has gone up 7-fold, according to the B'nai B'rith data, from 1982 to 2022. A very big increase, a 45-degree angle. But we also have contradictory information. We have a whole series of public opinion polls conducted by the Anti-Defamation League in the United States, cross-nationally, for example, which show that the level of sentiment, negative sentiment towards Jews in this country is actually among the lowest in the world. We're at the same level as the Netherlands or Sweden. And this is something that appears in many surveys. We have a recent poll from Angus Reid, which I'll show you now. This is from 2022. Respondents in Canada, not some of them were Jews, but most of them were not, were asked, in your view, would you say the presence of each of these religions in Canadian public life benefits or damages Canada and Canadian society? And here I've taken the percent who say benefits minus the percent that says damages. Well, guess who the most liked group is in Canadian society of all these religious groups? The answer, Jews. It may surprise, but it contradicts, I think, what the B'nai B'rith is telling us, what the very good information we have from the police on hate crimes and so on. And this kind of finding is repeated over and over. So we don't know how to reconcile these two things. We don't know how big anti-Semitism is as a problem in Canadian society, really. We have contradictory information. And we don't know what the real trends are, because we know that some of the data that we have from B'nai B'rith and from the Canadian police shows an upward trend, in part, we don't know how much, due to improved reporting over time, not necessarily due to some underlying increase in the level of anti-Semitism. Social scientists can and should and need to figure it out. But this is one of the chief issues I think we need to pay attention to figure out what's going on with anti-Semitism. We also need to know what categories of the population are responsible for anti-Semitic behaviors and sentiments in this country. We know very little about that. One thing I will tell you before I move on, because I've got a couple of minutes, is that this same Angus Reid poll taken last year showed that one of the groups which is most favorably disposed to the Jewish community, and this will surprise many of you, consists of Muslims. Only evangelical Protestants are fonder of Jews than Muslims are, which is interesting because to me, and I think Randy will talk about this a little bit too, this is an opportunity to build bridges and to face a common enemy in general, in racism and Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and so on. We can build bridges with the Muslim community. We shouldn't assume that Muslims necessarily dislike Jews. This is the kind of information, I think, that can lead to important policy initiatives. So that's one of the areas I think is of key importance.
Two most urgent questions.
Urgent. I don't know about urgent. First of all, I love the motif of questions. I think that's terrific. There are two books available for purchase over there. We have two of the authors here. Both of those books have titles with a question mark in them, which I think is a little original for social science work. One of them is called No Better Home, which is about Canadian Jewish life, and question mark. The subtext, as I read it, is, maybe Canada is now the best home for Jews. If you look at criteria like, on the one hand, Jewish identity, whatever that means, but also inclusion into Canadian life. So here's a trivia question for you Torontonians. I'm from McGill. But maybe some people will know there have been 3 Jews in Toronto who were elected as mayor, and 3 Jews who have been selected as leaders of the 3 Ontario political parties: Conservatives, Liberals, and NDP. If people know all 6, you're doing terrific. But if you don't, come see me after this show. So, no better home, question mark. An ever-dying people, question mark. And that's a response to the idea that Jews are always dying. And in fact, the subtext, as I see it, of Bob's work, with Randy, is they're not really dying. It's not so bad. Things are not so bad, which leads me to the famous or well-known sort of Jewish quip. If everything is so good, why is everything so bad? And that relates to what Bob presented. Something's going on, and we need to get a handle on what it is. To scream Gewalt all the time may not be the appropriate response. Specific issues that I think have been understudied. Now I'll get more micro in that sense. I'm interested, and it relates to this question of anti-Semitism, of course, in the idea of allyship. The idea that in the Canadian multicultural mosaic today, there's a lot of churn going on. Jews have historically seen themselves as allies to racialized minorities, whether indigenous or others. Jews have seen themselves as Are they? Is that still true? Question mark. And do the others perceive the Jews as allies today? Question mark, or not? And, you know, I can expand on the various factors. So I'm curious about where Jews situate themselves and are situated within the Canadian mosaic in terms of relations with the non-Jewish world, whether it's dialogue or confrontation, whatever it happens to be. The second thing that I'm interested in, and this may be my own quirk, but that's okay. And I think the study that Dr. Lenton and Bob Brym did found, that religion was not that central to Canadian Jewish identity. I want to ponder that a little more before I write off religion, because I have a very broad view of the religious options that are available, from Haredi on the one hand to the most liberal and progressive Jews on the other. And my own sense is that there is something going on. We may not be capturing that in survey data. I have been attending a variety of shuls here in Toronto, and I'm just, interested in what the new steps may be, the new evolution may be in the religious identity of Jews, the multidimensional religious identity of Jews. So that's something that I'm interested in, although I don't know if it's urgent or not. I don't know if the community, by the way, can really get itself involved in policy making favoring this type of Judaism versus another type of Judaism, because ultimately that's still a private affair. But as a sociologist, I find the new world of religion from the extreme right, and we all know where that's been coming from, but also to certain elements on the progressive left. And I'm interested in studying that, and maybe that will be one of the other items. I have more to say, but I think I'll pass on for that.
Fantastic questions, Randy.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think I have similar thoughts and themes as my colleagues here. Another Jewish quip that Bob and I wrote about in our book is talking about Jewish pessimists and Jewish optimists. And the Jewish pessimist said, "Oh, things are so bad, it can't get worse than this." And the Jewish optimist says, "Yes, it can." Don't be so pessimistic. So I think that's along the same line as we've heard. So I want to zero in on also a theme that we've heard, and I want to get right to the heart of the matter and talk about what a lot of people want to talk about, which is anti-Semitism. And just to really get at it, let's talk about anti-Semitism on campus. This is a topic that if I were to ask the question, in the spirit of asking a question that I do not know the answer to, what's the best way to address anti-Semitism on campus and other types of xenophobia and discrimination? There's a question that's a really difficult question that I don't have the answer to. So what I'm going to do is talk about one dimension that I'm passionate about, that I do know something about. And I'm not trying to say that I'm covering this topic comprehensively, because that's very difficult. The question that I would ask now as a sub-question is, what role can genuine dialogue between Jews and non-Jews, particularly Jews and Muslims, play in bringing about a more comfortable environment on campus? That's a question that interests me a lot, that I don't think we know enough about. And I ask that question because I have seen it happen in a very positive way. In the last few years, I've expanded my Jewish studies course offerings to include courses with Muslim content, Jewish Muslim comparative content. And it's a very, I think, strategic way to design courses. It attracts more students, and it allows for richer analysis, and it brings students together. So what I have found in my class is that if you provide a respectful and healthy environment, Jews and Muslims can thrive in trying to understand each other each other's point of view, look at the world through a different lens, and to really humanize the other, and to befriend their fellow classmates. And when you become friends with someone, it's much more difficult to dislike them or hate them. This has been very heartwarming for me to teach this class. In particular, I'm talking about a class I teach called Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Canada, which brings Jews, Muslims, and others together. The other thing that we don't know, which I learned teaching this class, is that many Muslims do not have a strong opinion about Israel-Palestine at all. This I learned, and this I don't think the community knows. So now I want to tell you. Many of my students, and this is probably true in many universities, many of my Muslim students are from South Asia. They're from India, from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, from Bangladesh. That's a long way from Israel. And they're very concerned sometimes about the India-Pakistan conflict. And they talk about Kashmir and Punjab. And they ask me, what do I think about it? And I don't even know much about it. It's just as they don't know necessarily so much about Israel-Palestine. But they are interested to learn. And they are interested to learn in particular what role Israel plays in the hearts and minds of Jewish Canadian students, many of them, because they didn't understand that. They didn't understand that Israel's the only Jewish state, and so it plays such a central and symbolic role for them. And this helps them to develop their own opinion and their own assessment of the conflict from not knowing that much about it. So the last thing I want to say about this is, how should we train high school students, Jewish students coming into university? What I see is kind of an adversarial approach. Let's arm those students with all the information they need to defend Israel against any accusations that they might come across. They will likely be accosted by anti-Israel sentiment, and we better arm them to be ready. I think there's room for that. And yes, you will be accosted sometimes by anti-Israel sentiment. I'm not naive, but I think another approach is a more collaborative, cooperative approach. How can we train Jewish high school students to come into university and think about trying to develop dialogue rather than trying to have their defensive points ready? How can they learn to listen to someone that they're not familiar with their views and try to understand them, and in that way have the other try to understand them? I don't think students are being trained to develop real dialogue. I think they're being trained to develop a monologue against another monologue, and they're not connecting. Like Martin Buber said, I and thou, true connection. So those are ideas that I'm passionate about. And if you think about Bob's data point that he just mentioned from Angus Reid, that the only group besides evangelical Protestants that think more highly of Jews are Muslims. Muslims seem to like Jews. And that data point that I learned from Bob really it encourages me. And I will be going on to do launch a project on Muslim-Jewish relations on campus. And I've been speaking to Hillel, and I'm going to speak to the Muslim Student Association. And I want to try to pursue these ideas and see what we can do to help address tension on campus.
And is it okay if Bob interject? Can I put you on pause briefly? I'll be very brief. I just wanted to thank Randy
For telling that wonderful joke from our book, but I want to tell you, there's an Israeli version of that joke as well. Two guys meet on the street, two Jews meet on the street in Tel Aviv. And one guy says to the other, how are you? And the other says, in a word, good. In two words, not good.
I heard the same version of that joke like that.
Are you okay?
Two guys meet, just hang on. First Jew says, how are you? The second Jew says, how should I be?
Okay, dang.
Do you have a quick?
How do I follow that? Let me just start by saying it is such a pleasure to be here. I feel like I'm sitting on a panel with all my teachers, and I feel so fortunate to be in this room in this conversation. My job is really about the application of research. We are incredibly fortunate to have a research team at Federation led by Esther Maher, who's with us today. And her job is to develop the data we need to make good evidence-based decisions to think about how we strengthen our community. That comes in lots of different forms. Over the last number of years, we could talk about lots of research projects that we've done ourselves to answer very specific questions. The choice of how people choose their high school, what's happening in the York Region Jewish community, what kind of role does sports play in Jewish engagement? We're currently doing significant work around Hebrew language education, the attitudes that parents, teachers, and students have towards Hebrew. The relationship with Israel, which we didn't mention, which I haven't mentioned yet, but like, what does the evolving relationship of Israel with Israel of our community, how does that play out? The list goes on and on and on. The elasticity of demand for Jewish day school, obviously something I'm deeply inside. But these are all about the application of research, and for me, that is critical. As we think about contemporary Canadian Jewry, it's important for me to have the evidence base to think about how do we best affect change to create the most vital and vibrant Jewish community. I think there are two things that are most urgent for me in that. One is around Jewish identity and Jewish engagement, and the second is around what we're learning from the census data as it comes out. On the Jewish engagement side, we used to talk about how many Jews are there, then we would talk about how Jews are Jewish. And we used to talk about how many Jews are there. Then we would talk about how Jewish are the Jews. Now we're talking about how the Jews are Jewish. And by that, I mean really four questions. One is, who are the Jews? Two is, what do they currently do Jewishly? Three is, what would they do Jewishly? And fourth is, what are the barriers for participation? We need to think about how we engage the greatest number of Jews in our community and how we can empower them to live Jewish lives and to choose a Jewish life for themselves, because the way that we are Jewish is changing so rapidly. So that's one piece around Jewish engagement. Who are they? What do they currently do Jewishly? What would they do? And what are the barriers for participation? The second piece of urgent research or urgent questions that we need to understand is what the current census data is telling us. I think the current census, especially for the Toronto Jewish community, is really, really interesting. We are seeing an aging Jewish community. In the 2011 National Household Survey, there were 30,000 Jews in Toronto over the age of 65. Today, they're 44,000. What does that mean for the future of our community? What does that mean for all the services we offer, be they in Jewish education or in human services or in philanthropy? What does that mean, and how does that need to change the tenor of our conversation in our community? Number two is our community is spreading out. I remember Michael Brown, my teacher, Zichrono Livracha, used to tell me that in the 1991 census, 80% of the Jewish community in Toronto lived within 5 kilometers of Bathurst and Shepherd. Today, that's not the case. We are spreading out, and we are spreading out across the GTA and beyond the GTA into areas where there historically haven't been Jews. The tripling of the Jewish community in Barrie, Ontario. What does that mean for the development of Jewish education, Jewish human services, the infrastructure we need? And equally, I'd say there's a certain kind of Jew who's moving there. I believe that what's happening in the Orthodox community is actually quite different. What we are seeing right now in the Orthodox community is not that they are moving to Barrie or Innisfil or Guelph or Waterloo or Aurora or Newmarket, but they are leaving Toronto and leaving Canada and going to Cleveland and Atlanta and Florida and Lakewood, New Jersey and Israel, depending on who they are religiously. And I say that because those questions that we're seeing play out in the census right now around aging, around urban sprawl, many of which, by the way, are determined by the cost of housing in Toronto, are going to change the nature of our community. And if we don't use this data or these data to develop strategies for the application of these data to develop the future of our community, I think we'll be losing out in that planning function.
Great question. So I want to come back to the 2018 survey of Jews in Canada that Bob and Rhonda and Keith Newman did this incredibly valuable work. The survey, as you probably know, was created because of the bungled 2016 federal census, which you skipped because it was so bungled. This was the survey that made it seem that the Canadian Jewish population, half of it disappeared since the prior census. So the data were bad. So this new sort of by Jews for Jews survey that was sort of modeled after the Pew survey about US Jews was much more robust, first of all, than any federal census would have been. And it's still being mined for insight 5 years later. I have a three-part question for you, Mort, although you can all answer it as well if you want to chip in. First of all, what questions still need to be asked about those data from the survey and from the newest census data, which just came out, the newest federal census data? Second is, how often should the by Jews for Jews research be redone so that we can get a sense about trends and change over time? And lastly, are there changes in the questions or in the methods that you think should happen for future iterations of the survey?
Well, I can answer some of those questions better than others. I think we need a major survey every decade. Not just a census of Canadian Jews, but something that's much more, as you put it, robust, that asks questions about identity and practice and needs and wants and attitudes and so on. Which means that we ought to be thinking about doing another survey for 2028. It's not cheap. The survey that we did, if you take into account all of the money that was invested in it and the time that was invested in it, probably cost $500,000. And a third of which was supplied by the Jewish communities of Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg, and the rest of which came from research grants that we had and the beneficence of Environics, which chipped in very generously as well. So that's something that needs to be planned in advance. And I hope that it is planned in advance, because we need to know, if we want to know where we're going, we need to know where we are. And I think that doing a decennial survey is a very good idea. In terms of mining more from the survey, that's something I would have to think about, because we've just spent a couple of years, Randy and I and 24 other authors, trying to mine the survey. And I wanted to take a pause from all the mining work. So my suggestion is, if you want to know what more we've done since the survey, and on the census, a good place to start would be this book that we've done called The Ever-Dying People, ? A comparative study of Jews of Canada, because not only do we talk about Canadian Jews, but we talk about Jews in comparison with Jews in Australia and the UK, the United States, and elsewhere.
And the other dimension of Jews compared with others.
And we compare Jews with other ethnic and religious groups in Canada. There's a chapter called Are the Chinese Canada's New Jews? We look at the ethnic composition of Jews in the U of T Medical School from 1918 to 2018, to show how changes have occurred and what accounts for changes. By the way, Jews were at their high point in the U of T Medical School in 1978 and have been declining as a proportion ever since, as other groups have come in as new immigrants and so on. So we've been answering other questions with the data from the census and from the survey, and I invite people to take a look at the book and find out what we've been doing.
Please do. Although, you know what, actually, if we could pass you a mic, then the people who are online can also hear.
Mainly due to financial reasons, we ended up having to limit the survey to 4 major cities in Canada. And, there's not like there's one big list somewhere, right? So you have that, the problem. I would really like to go back to some of the other cities and try to include more cities, especially so that you could really compare the Jews that are in large urban areas we noted in the study that there were significant differences between Vancouver and what, the behavior of Jews in Vancouver compared to Toronto and Montreal, and Winnipeg being kind of in between. So, Halifax, Ottawa, these would be really interesting comparisons. And I think with all surveys, you're always making compromises at how deep you can go on any of the variables. And so understanding the barriers in different areas, understanding really what, diving deeper on culture versus ethnicity versus religion in terms of identity. One point I really don't want to leave people with the impression, I was worried that I left you with the impression after Mort's comment, was it wasn't that the majority of the respondents didn't find religion to be a component of their identity. It was when asked, is religion the major component of your identity? And that's where you didn't see the majority of Jews, but the majority of Jews did list religion as a component along with ethnicity and culture. So, there's all of these, you can always dive deeper, and there's just so much more that could be done, with, more cities and, more finances.
That's a great lead into the question that I had next, but I'm glad that you mentioned this is about small town and rural Jews. You want to jump in? Go for it. You go for it.
I'd like to say two things. One is the 2018 survey of Canadian Jews has been critical for our application and thinking about how we strengthen the Jewish community. A couple of concrete examples. One is that there's an overarching trope around Canadian exceptionalism, right? And the importance of education for that piece of for developing Canadian exceptionalism. It also underscored the issues of affordability, right? Both for Jewish day schools, but for other settings also, for synagogue participation, for all kinds of things. That's led to very clear policy decisions that we've made around doubling down on Jewish education, addressing the barrier of affordability in multiple settings. Those have been critical for us. We're now doing work, as I said, around Hebrew language education and have been using the data from the 2018 survey of Canadian Jews as the basis for research we are doing now to understand approaches and attitude of students, teachers, and parents, and how we can use those to better hone Hebrew language education as what in 2018 was a core differentiator between Canadian and American Jewry. But I would say if we're going to expand on that study, right, I believe it did an excellent job because Pew had been just 3 years earlier of comparing Canadian Jewry to American Jewry. I'd be very curious to think about our relationship with or comparisons of Canadian Jewry to other Commonwealth countries where No Better Home asks some questions comparing Canadian Jewry to Australian Jewry, South African Jewry, British Jewry, only place where I have relatives. But those comparators may actually draw better data for us to think about application than the American Jewish community.
You'll find some of that in the book.
I will read.
So these are we got a good question list going. I wondered if maybe Randy and Mort could speak briefly about the data and the research that we have or we lack about the so-called non-core Jews. So Rhonda mentioned Jews who live in smaller towns and cities. I'm also thinking about, Mizrahi Jews, Jews of color, LGBTQ Jews, Jews who identify as both Jewish and something else, Orthodox Jews, Russian Jews, Israelis. What's the kind of state of our social science data on these subpopulations? You want to go first?
Yeah, I will. There was an interesting article written 12 years ago. Recent developments on the social scientific study of Canadian Jews,
I recognize that title.
because it was written by David and myself. Now, this was published 12 years ago, and I reread it, and a lot of it still, makes a certain amount of sense. And one of the interesting findings, but then I'll answer your question, was, or in conclusion, was that, there are sort of partly misplaced efforts to understand the Canadian Jewish experience as wholly distinct from the American counterpart, meaning more comparisons with the American case. When I first began looking at this issue, I started teaching this stuff at McGill in 1977. The question that I had then, and that I still have, is to what extent, because we know that Canadian Jewry looks good compared to the American case, and I even wrote a chapter in David's book. I compared Canada, the US, England, and France on a variety of, the usual suspects that we round up, okay? And Canada did look good in a comparative perspective. So, that was the question then. But as I just said, we rounded up the usual suspects. We did not include the kind of questions that you just posed about the pluralism within the Canadian Jewish community. That wasn't there. It's not in, and even in the course that I teach and in the book that I wrote with Randy, in 2018, based on my course, that wasn't a key element. It should have been more than it was, but it was not. And it would be my fault. In the same way that religion in that book, we have 10 chapters, only one on religion, 9 on other stuff. The other stuff is interesting, but again, I think now religion got short shrift. So on the question that you pose about really, which is a sort of pluralism in the Jewish community, I don't think we know a great deal. And it's not just Mizrahi. I mean, the United States is even more seized with this issue of non-white Jews coming from a variety of sources. In Canada, we have to pose the question, to what extent do we want to include, let's say, Sephardic Jews who come from countries which in the Canadian census might also get you status as a visible minority. And that would be a large number. So what do we do with that? And with that, I just want to make one point. We're talking here in this panel largely about what I would call data and data collection, defining the terms, getting the data, collecting the data, and we're basically tilting towards survey data, which is most useful for the kind of work that Daniel and colleagues have to do, and I understand that. But I am also interested in the kinds of deeper questions that may not lend themselves to survey data. But, things are going on, and I don't know what the best approach may be for researchers to try to unpack what is going on in some of these, let's say, historically more marginal communities, but even in the kind of, we talk about intermarriage as a number. But the fact is, if you probe more deeply beyond the numbers, it's very interesting to see how Canadians and Canadian students, my students, are navigating, because they're all called, because they're celebrating Christmaka. It's not a TV show, it's real. And they all have hyphenated names. And one of the names is Jewish, and one of the names is not. And let me tell you, they're all over they're Quebecois names, there are all sorts of other names. I don't know if we're getting close with the instruments that we have right now to understanding what's going on at that level. Is this urgent? I don't know. Funding for day schools may be more urgent. But as a sociologist, I find what I just said very interesting and probably will be playing a greater role in the future of Canadian Jewish life. And then we can compare to how it's, going on. Are we still going to retain the Canadian advantage, or over time, are we going to move closer and closer to the American experience? And if you believe in the importance of multiculturalism, then you will say, yes, Canada will always be distinct. If you're looking at sort of demographic processes, a lot of Canadian Jews now have more and more ties and are moving to the United States. There may be people in this room. Then there may be convergence ahead. I don't know the answer, but I think both are likely. But I'm not certain that what we're doing is getting us closer to understanding that. I'll stop.
Randy, you want to try this one? So I was asking about, what are the actual numbers, or do you have a sense of what we know or what we still need to know about the needs, the differences, the desires of, let's say, non-mainstream Jews versus mainstream Jews, just to make it simple?
I can say a word about LGBTQ Jews and also Black Jews, although I'm afraid I won't be able to say as much as I would want to say. I think on LGBTQ Jews, there are a handful of articles and some research. My PhD dissertation in 2003 was about gay Jewish men in Toronto. And then I published an article in 2006, and you and I, Mort, published an article around that time as well. And we did write about it in the 2018 book a little bit. But there are mostly American articles that are helpful in understanding how to negotiate your Jewish identity with your sexual orientation. And I don't think the American and Canadian cases are dramatically different, and they're helpful. We're starting to talk about transgender Jews a little bit now. It's on the radar screen. I have seen articles, not too much academics, sometimes halachic articles or rabbinic articles that can be useful, not particularly Canadian. So a lot of work to be done there. On Black Jews, which is becoming a very important topic as well, there's a new organization in Toronto called No Silence on Race, which is a organization to promote and raise awareness of the Black Jewish community, of which there are Jews from many different parts of the world. But in terms of academic articles, especially in Canada, we are in infant stages. There's an excellent film that No Silence on Race came out with called Periphery. And it was really the George Floyd incident which galvanized, I think the Jewish community started to talk about racism within our community in a serious way after the George Floyd incident. Not that the George Floyd incident was a Jewish incident, but it caused some turning inwards, and it launched that organization, No Silence on Race. A lot more work to do. We have many sub-communities with different needs. So
if we think about how to engage the broadest swath of the Jewish community, we want to be able to answer 4 questions. Who are they? What do they currently do Jewishly? What would they do Jewishly? And what are the barriers for entry? A good chunk of our thinking over the last number of years has been on 3 sub-communities who we've noted their growth through the census data: the Russian-speaking Jewish community, the Israeli Jewish community, and the interfaith community. And I'll say on that third one, so we have good research that we've commissioned on each of those. The third one was most notable in the last census. The intermarriage rate in Toronto was 17%, according to the census analysis, was 15% in the previous census, but 28% of young Jews under the age of 30 were intermarried, which gives us a leading indicator. We don't yet have data from this census. So we commissioned a study looking at the interfaith community, largely not survey data, largely, I mean, Esther could say a lot more and I'm nervous I'm stepping out of bounds, but like largely focus groups and interviews with young Jews to understand those 4 questions. Who are they? What do they do Jewishly? What do they currently do Jewishly? What would they do? And what are the barriers for entry? The report itself, and I think names are important, didn't have a question mark, but had a period at the end, which was swimming upstream, right? People who want to be engaged in the Jewish community, but are constantly feeling that they are swimming upstream. That resulted in specific interventions and investments to help organizations engage that community. And we need to do similar things for other sub-communities as we discussed.
I just want to give one statistic from the most recent 2021 census, which does ask people if they consider themselves a member of a visible minority group, and also asks people their religion and their ethnicity. And from cross-classifying those variables, we know that the percentage of Jews who consider themselves to be members of a visible minority group is 3%. 3%, which is, and in the States, the Pew 2020 survey asked members of the sample if they were people of color, and 7% in the US said they were people of color. Just
what's notable is that census data is wonderful because it gives the broadest cross-cutting. We do a lot of work because of cost, which is based on lists. So the PJ Library list in Toronto captures about 72% of young families in Toronto. So it is a great list. I don't remember the number, but it is significantly higher of the PJ Library families who see themselves as being people of color, or which is notable. Now, it comes from a list study. There are lots of, you can't really compare apples to apples, but having that list is tremendously valuable for us to best understand the young community who may also skew differently in terms of their affiliations.
So we made this turn to methodological issues, from survey data to list data to interview, focus group, different styles, social research. This is my last question. I want to make sure we have some time for questions from the floor, but I'm thinking about artificial intelligence research and what may come from like big data questions. So look, most people in the world, like Canadian Jews, like most people, have left this, massive set of traces of their lives online, about their habits, about their intentions, about their intimacies, etc. So I wonder if you have any thoughts. I know I didn't prep you for this question, but if you have any thoughts about how this new tech might change the face of social research, beyond surveys themselves. Do we have any sense of like what these new incredibly powerful tools, how they might be harnessed for social research, academic or applied?
Want to start?
Well, I'm not sure I can say anything about artificial intelligence, but I know that we haven't used the web as efficiently as we can. Data can be scraped from the web automatically. We can find out how many anti-Semitic statements are made on Twitter every single day.
It's called sort of big data research.
This is big data.
Harvesting research.
Yeah.
Different from AI,
And
but
we haven't done that. It would be a great source of information. We could see trends over time. We could perhaps even identify the kinds of people who are making various kinds of statements, which would be useful for understanding what's going on. I'm sure there are other opportunities as well. That doesn't necessarily involve artificial intelligence, but I've thought about doing some data scraping, as it's called, on the web to find out these kinds of things.
It's such a good question, David, and I think it falls into the category of we don't know the answer to that yet. I just found out about AI.
Today you're in a safe space.
Yeah.
We don't know.
That's-
No need to be an
It's
expert
so
here.
much easier when you can just say you don't know this, because then you're right in line with the panel.
I've got a mobile phone. You could ask ChatGPT.
Yeah. I mean, when I found out about ChatGPT was November 22, and then the problem is in Jewish studies and all the studies, it's the students not doing their own work now and typing in the answer to ChatGPT. So I know that, but you're asking something much more important. And I think maybe when we look back on this panel in 5 or 10 years, we'll be thinking, boy, we had a lot to learn. I think we're just in the infant stages. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we know much about AI. I don't even think we know enough about social media generally and how that has impacted Jewish life, especially among the younger elements. And I'm using a very broad term of, websites, but also communications. I mean, and what you read now, the mantra is by scholars who study AI, and that they say, oh, we better do better with AI than we did with social media, because we jumped into social media and there were a lot of problems that emerged from social media. Now, I don't know if that's true. There are all sorts of problems you hear about, especially for young people and younger people and pressures and all that. But there's wonderful stuff that we get from social media, no question. So I would like to, and I know that there are Jewish websites, we all know, where Jews meet other Jews for all sorts of reasons and all sorts of interests. I've seen a few studies that talk about things like JDate and things of that sort. But I don't think there's but is there a huge set of research studies on that for Jews? I really don't know. And I think even less for AI.
I think we are many steps before AI, right? We aren't even at big data yet, right? Nor are we even at synonymous or mirrored or even yoked research. The 2018 survey of Canadian Jews was a phenomenal example of yoked research building off of Pew from 2013, Pew from 2020, allows us to learn from that. But much of our research is sort of like one shot. And I say this because if we could get to the place where we could use big data, we'd be able to answer much bigger and broader questions by using the same questions with the same samples and growing one on the other. One of the notes I would make on what we don't know is that we can currently measure outputs, but not outcomes. So I'll give the example of Jewish education, right? I can tell you how many people go to Jewish camp and how many people go to supplementary school and how many people go to day school and how many people do all these things, right? That's great. And I can even say there's certain interventions that we do which allow us to increase those numbers, dealing with affordability, increasing marketing. I can't yet talk with real credibility about the outcomes, right? What is the impact of any of any of those interventions? Or how is that intervention skewed because of everything else going on in people's lives, right? I believe in the impact of Jewish day schools. We've seen a quarter century of research that says Jewish day schools are impactful. I also recognize that when families are willing to invest so much money in their kids' Jewish education, they're probably also living a rich Jewish life at home, sending their kids to camp, involved in synagogue life, things like that, which also influence their lives. And I can't tease those out. Before we can get to AI, I want us to be able to get to big data and making use of our data. Before we can get to big data, I want us to get to the place where we're using the same questions across multiple surveys. Before we do that, I want us to get to the place where we're using similar samples. So like, there is a lot there before we get to AI, though AI may creep up on us faster and faster and faster.
Okay, let's take some questions from the floor here. I have all these questions that came from the Q&A from people who joined us online. But let's get a couple from here first. Yes, please go ahead. Actually, there's a mic that Julie's going to pass to you so people can hear you.
Question is for Bob. You talk about people identifying with religion. Do you have to believe in God to be religious? We need to understand the percentage of I also think you have to understand in the Bronfman Foundation, Tom Axworthy ran it in Montreal, and they retained us to do a study of the Jewish community. And there was two principles, the role of education and the role of Israel. And we found that the role of Israel was far more important in people identifying with Jews than education. We were chastised by all of the organized Jewish education institutions because a trip to Israel for 2 weeks actually influenced people's behavior more than 10 years of Jewish education. So it seems to me we have to come back, not just counting. When I'm listening to you, you're doing a lot of counting. But as scientists, social scientists, I haven't heard anybody tell me what makes an anti-Semite. Two people growing up in the same family, one's an anti-Semite and one isn't. Why? What happened to that person to become an anti-Semite? And I'll give you one anecdote. I did this, by the way, all of the studies that we did were donated to York. So there's a number of studies that are relevant to what you're talking about that are in New York archives. But there's one study I did that I'll never forget. We were retained by the Jesuits to do a study on how to recruit for the Jesuits. In the process, I interviewed young boys who could become a Jesuit, but were going to Catholic schools. The degree of anti-Semitism from those kids was enormous. That is, they were being taught how to hate Jews in those schools. So when we reported it, they wanted to bury it. So it seems to me we need to understand what makes an anti-Semite and not just counting how many anti-Semites are out there.
So if I could paraphrase the question, do you want, is this what you passed me the mic for, Grant, to paraphrase the question? Oh, there's a problem with my mic. Okay, so I'll take the questions, or if I could boil them down simply to two. There was a question about belief in God, about how much do we know about it? How necessary is it for the social research that we have on religious identity? And the second was basically, what do we know about anti-Semites, about how, the study of anti-Semites, not about its impact on Jews or about its occurrence rates, but other studies. Do we know, we have any real social research about what makes anti-Semites here?
Well, we do have information on the number or the proportion of Jews who say they believe in no religion. And we know from the census, every 10 years, the question is asked. Now, about 1/3 of people who identify as Jewish in Canada say they have no religion. The same proportion approximately for non-Jews, about 1/3. And it's going up with every census. So
We don't know about if they believe in God, I don't think.
now, belief in God is something else. We usually now it's the common question is, do you believe in God or a higher spiritual being?
But the census doesn't ask.
The
that.
census doesn't ask
That's right.
that.
Okay,
So you're right. We need more information on that.
go ahead, Morton.
Yeah, very quickly, I've always had a beef with the census because when they ask you your ethnic origin, you can go up to 6. The question is, what is your religion, period? Now, if you check off atheist or agnostic, I have a whole series of, then they put you in the category of
No religion.
no religion. In my view, this is incorrect. Now, I've always, I said to them, why do you have to choose? If you're part Christian, part Jewish, why do you have to pick one? Because that's what happens in the census. And yeah, well, but I think eventually they may have to go beyond 1, as they do with ethnic origin, up to 6. But in the other issue, I think there's a more substantive question. I think you can have your religion being Jewish and not believe in God, like me. All right. I go to shul. I mean, there are many things that I do. And on the census, I will always, now, thank God they don't ask me, do you believe in God? Because I would give them a big problem.
Thank
I
who?
would say
Thank
no,
who?
but I'm going to shul, right?
Why are you thanking God?
So there you go. There you go. But the point, that's exactly the point. It's a slippery, interesting, nuanced question, which the census, in my view, does not capture. And as time will go on, it's going to capture less. As people are getting more spiritual, but as there's more interfaith marriages and people are constructing or negotiating their own kind of religion. I'm a sort of a Durkheimian, if that means anything to anybody about these things. So I'm not invested in belief per se.
Do either of you have a response to the studying anti-Semites prompt?
That's a tough
You
one.
don't have to.
I think across the board, we struggle with causation and correlation. I could say the same thing for what makes someone an anti-Semite, and I could say the same thing about, on the other side, what makes someone a committed and vibrant and vital Jew. Like, I think we struggle to understand what are the factors that lead to any kind of outcome in an individual, and that plays out across the board. And that's something we need to work on.
Mir. You know what? Actually, we need a mic as well for you.
I did have a question. This would be for, I guess, for the panel, So I have recently, as in like a couple of days ago, read an article in Forward. So they look at the American Jews, and the article said that there is a clear tendency that Jews in the United States are becoming either very religious, moving towards more stricture in religious observance, or they're more and more sort of abandoning, any kind of regular observance.
Polarization.
So so I was wondering whether this has to do with the general polarization in the American society, and how much should we worry about it? Because I believe it would be particularly relevant, Daniel, for you, JA, because you operate in this sort of golden middle, right? You cater to try to cater to as many people as possible. So yeah, this question would be towards that, because we said that there are a lot of Canadian Jews, depending on on demographics, that they move to the States and so on. So what can we learn anything from this particular tendency?
Let me offer two pictures of enrollment at Tannenbaum Chat, right? Toronto's community high school. When I was teaching there at the school 15, 20 years ago, the majority of our students were came from elementary schools being associated, some kids from Netivot, a good number from USDS. So at the time, Associate was a 2,000 kid school, USDS was a 1,300 kid school. Bialik and Leobeck were probably 600 kid schools, and we had a couple of dozen kids in a new stream program who had not been in Jewish day school before. Today, if you look at that picture of who's coming into that school, Associated has now 1,000 kid school, right? Bialik is now a 1,400 kid school. Leo Beck is a 600 kid school, but like, USDS, which is now RHA, is about a 400 kid school, 500 kids, right? That is a significant change, which I'm just using day school enrollment as a proxy for like, where are kids and what are parents looking for? A significant change in the population that's going into our community high school and the day schools that people are filling with. That is part of that collapse of that vibrant center. Now, I strongly believe in the vibrancy and vitality of like Bialik and the kids who are coming out of there and their sense of self and their sense of Jewish self and their Zionism. Like that is really, really powerful. It's also a real change from what was the Associated and USDS of the day. And I think that's part of what you're seeing. And then that comes back to our four questions, always four questions, right? Who are the Jews? What do they currently do? What would they do? And what are the barriers for entry that we need to think about to strengthen every segment of our community?
I'm mindful of our time. Oh my God, there's so many good questions. We have like
Mr. Koshitsky has
we have like 5 minutes. Let's get a couple more. I've got like a dozen great ones that have come in online. Let's go to Henry first. Then I got one from here, and then if we have time, we'll see where we go. Yeah.
The one thing that I must have missed, maybe I dozed off, is what exactly is the point of all of this? What do we want to, what is our goal? What do we really want to do? I mean, I don't think, how is this going to preserve Jewish society? 31% religious and the rest not. I don't think that is the issue. The issue is, and the question is being Jewish a fact in a person's life? And how do we make Judaism part of that life? That's very interesting. It was mentioned the fact, I don't believe in God, but I still go to shul. Jewish religion is a religion of practice. It's not a religion of belief. I mean, I think anybody who wants to follow up on that, I suggest they read Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, a letter in a scroll. He spends the whole time, he says, you don't have to believe in God. God, it's not essential for you to believe in God. It's a question of what you do to make yourself a Jew. And I think this is the important thing, is to say to yourself, now what do we want to accomplish with all these studies that we're going to do? How is it going to lead us to preserving and making sure that the Jewish religion, not religion, the Jewish people survive forever? And just a little thing on the side, it occurred to me on that, you took it off, it was very interesting to see that the people who most like the Jews are the people who are most hated. If you look at that thing, so that shows you anti-Semitism. Because they like us, that's why they're hated.
So I'm going to turn this into a little bit of a question. You want to respond?
I just say one comment. You know, Mr. Koshitsky, if you were to ask me what would be the most important thing we could do with carrying on with the research, the most important question, it was understanding the pattern around the cohesiveness of the Jewish people. And when we did this study, a lot of people asked us, is Canada just 20 years behind the US when it comes to cohesiveness, when you compare Canadian Jews and the US Jews? And it's exactly the kinds of questions which were, what makes you, define yourself as a Jew, and what can we do? How can we engage? It goes back to the 4 questions that are being asked. Survey research can help you with that. It can help you understand what are the factors, what that will support the cohesiveness of the Jewish people. And then responding to that, do we need to provide access to synagogue? What are the barriers to going to synagogue? Or do we need to access to day school, to summer camps, to friends, people who are in isolated community? There's a lot of rich data in that survey that we have been trying to respond to by going to synagogues, by going to, talking to other organizations. So there's really important answers in that data that can help us make sure that we are thinking about the cohesiveness of Jews in the future. We're not following the US.
So I'm going to take, Henry, what you said as well and put it into another question just for the panelists as well, because it's really about what's the value of social science research on Canadian Jewish life. And I think there's a real question about whether applied research and academic research have the same kinds of answers. So I'd be curious, it's kind of a cringeworthy question, frankly, for me to ask, what's the point of doing this? But I think we actually do need to articulate, the purpose of social research. What's the point of it? And I'm curious if our panelists have different perspectives about the answer. So I'm going to put it to them to answer, and we'll see if it's similar or different. We'll just have to leave it at their answers. Do you want to start, Dan?
No.
Will you start?
Yes.
Give me your arm. I'll twist it.
I want to think about how we create the most vital and vibrant Jewish community. And I think that is our vision for the future. My colleague Esther today had a paper accepted into a well-respected journal that looks at social bonding, which looks at what does Jewish cohesion look like and how do we measure that? Two questions. One is, how important to you is being Jewish? And two is, I'm going to get this wrong, what is your social network, the people around you, and how many of them are Jewish? And that correlates to all kinds of other Jewish activities, Jewish giving, going to synagogue, like all kinds of other things. And understanding social bonding and creating stronger social bonds within the Jewish community, I believe, is what's going to create a more vital and vibrant Jewish community into the future.
Although I'm an academic researcher, some of the research that's been most meaningful for me is to do applied research and with Dan and the Federation. And when we saw the decline of enrollment at Tannenbaum Chat, or at its peak in 2007, and then 10 years later, it dropped by almost a half. The UJA commissioned a research consulting firm called Rossoff Consulting, and I was delighted to be the local researcher to collect qualitative data, to interview potential chat parents, focus groups with grade 8 kids, and to see what are the barriers, as you may put it, to why they may not go to chat. And one of the requests was to reduce the Jewish studies mandatory component from 4 Jewish studies courses to 3. So why would Jewish families want less Jewish studies? So that's, I think, a panel for next week, maybe, right? But the other one, which was not surprising, was it's way too expensive. But the question we wanted to dig in, so if we reduced it by 10%, would that make a difference? And I know it's all very familiar to you. If we reduced it by 10%, would it make a difference? Not really. 20%? 30%? That was like the point where families said, okay, if it was 30%, then we would consider going to chat. So this is applied research, which became very useful because we reported the findings to chat and to UJA, and I didn't know what was going to be like. So it's a great finding. Reduce it by 30%, and you're going to have enrollment. And then March of 2017, I was absolutely surprised. I was not in the loop. Absolutely delighted to hear that community philanthropists had stepped up for a very sizable donation, which in effect could reduce the tuition by 30%. And the enrollment went up immediately. And now it's, I believe, around 1,300, 1,350, which is almost getting as close as it was. And so it's a very instructive example of strategic partnership. You've got UJA, you've got Tannenbaum Chat itself, then you hire the professional applied researchers who have expertise on Canadian Jewish life, and then you partner with community philanthropists. It's a great success story. And personally, it helped me and my wife decide that, yes, indeed, we can send our son to chat. And my wife and I met at chat, and we always wanted to send our son to chat. But when it went to 28,500, we probably weren't going to do it. And so I had a great academic interest and community policy interest and personal interest. So it all came together for me. So that's my good news story. And the and the impact of applied research.
Okay, Mort and Bob, why are you in this business of the research? Is it the same answers? You've got different answers.
Well, maybe this is partly an answer to Henry Koshitsky. I think that what we're all doing is conducting research that'll facilitate the continuity of the Jewish community. That's the underlying thread here and the motivation for all of us. And I really don't see the distinction so clearly between academic and applied research. I never ask myself if I'm doing one or the other, because the academic research has implications for policy research and vice versa. I mean, you know, some of the things that Daniel said today, he's an applied researcher, have piqued my curiosity as an academic, and hopefully vice versa. That's why it's a good idea to have a panel like this.
Yeah, I sort of agree with Bob. Maybe that's not a surprise. Look, we have two hats. Actually, I have three. One is my Canadian ethnicity hat, which is another kettle of fish. But then in the Jewish case, I've always tried to tell my students, etc., that when I teach them the sociology of North American Jewish life, I'm using the Jews as a case study. I don't want my course to be seen as cheerleading for the Jews. I love the Jews, but that's not what my course is about. My course is analyzing the Jewish experience, its pros and its cons, its ups and its downs, its challenges, its successes, for their own interest, but because I think the Jewish experience actually is of interest not only to Jews, but I could argue for all sorts of other minority groups in Canada, and I can support that if I had to, okay? But so in a sense, I make that pitch, but I know full well that what I hope when I write books, when I teach in my classroom, is that I am also, in a sense, conveying some ideas that will make the Jewish students perhaps appreciate being Jewish more. And frankly, the non-Jewish students also appreciate what the Jewish community and Judaism has to offer. Now, maybe I shouldn't be doing that, but I think that's what happens.
It's too late to change now.
Can't change that.
So folks, I hate ending because there's so much more to do. I know there's questions here from the floor. I know that there's a lot of brilliant questions that came in on the Q&A, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we're going to obviously have more questions. May the conversation continue. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you. Thank you for joining us, Alton.
You should tell them the email addresses. If you have questions, they can bring it to us.
Thank you for.
Do you have a minute?
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Careful.
So you could take this, take our stuff.